Bistritz, May 3rd. I left Munich at 8:35 a.m. on May 1st and arrived in Vienna early the next morning. I was supposed to arrive at 6:46 a.m., but the train was delayed by an hour. From what I could see through the train window, combined with the scenery along the way, Budapest seemed like a wonderful city. I was too cautious to venture far from the station because, if I got delayed, the train would still depart on time, as usual. Traveling from the west to the east, crossing the westernmost bridge over the Danube, left a lasting impression on me. The journey was taking me to a land of grandeur, with customs and traditions that harked back to the days of the Turkish Empire. We bid farewell to this land with cheerful hearts, and as night fell, we arrived at Klausenberg. I stayed overnight at the Royal Hotel. For dinner, or rather supper, I had chicken cooked with peppers. It was delicious, though it made me extremely thirsty. I must remember the recipe for Mina. I asked the waiter, and he told me the dish was called paprika Händel, a local specialty. I could have it anywhere in the Carpathians. Fortunately, I knew a bit of German, which helped me a lot. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to gather such useful information. In preparation for my trip to London, I had visited the British Museum and pored over books and maps in the library about Transylvania. This gave me some important insights into how to communicate with the local aristocracy in this region. The land I sought was far to the east of this country, nestled between the borders of Transylvania, Moldavia, and Bukovina, deep within the Carpathian Mountains. It is one of the wildest and least known areas in Europe. No map helped me pinpoint the location of Dracula's castle. It seemed that the maps of this country here were no comparison to the navigational charts we use. Fortunately, Bistritz, the town where Count Dracula had sent me a letter, was not as mysterious. I would make sure to keep a record of this journey, which would help me recall the details when I tell Mina about my travels. The people of Transylvania belong to 4 different ethnic groups. The Saxons in the south, mingling with the Wallachians, descendants of the Dacians, the Magyars in the west, and the Sakeli people in the east and north. I was among the latter, proud descendants of Attila and the Huns. This pride likely stems from the fact that the Huns settled here before the Magyars invaded in the 11th century. Perhaps all the superstitions in the world have concentrated in this Carpathian rock, throwing me into a whirlpool of fascinating imaginations as I stopped here. I must tell the Count about this. I couldn't sleep much, despite the comfort of my bed, as I had already gathered enough bizarre dreams throughout the night. Perhaps it was because of a mournful howl from a dog, as if it were facing some kind of calamity, lingering by my window, or maybe the damned peppers had left me parched, despite drinking an entire jug of water. Near dawn, I finally managed to sleep, only to be woken by persistent knocking at the door. It was as if I had fallen into a deep sleep the moment I shut my eyes. I was served breakfast with peppers, including a porridge-like dish made from a yellow powder called mamaliga, and a meat-stuffed cabbage dish called implatata. Of course, I must write down the recipe for this. I had to eat quickly, as the train was scheduled to depart just before 8. After rushing to the station at 7:30, I had to wait for over an hour in the carriage before departure. Perhaps the further east you go, the more punctual the trains are. I wonder how things are in China. The whole day was filled with scenic views as we traveled across the country. Occasionally, we passed small towns, castles perched on the tops of steep hills, bringing us into the atmosphere of ancient times. At other times, we crossed rivers and streams, with wide, rocky banks teeming with the relentless rush of tidal waves that swept away everything in their path. At each station, groups of people, sometimes crowds, were dressed in a variety of outfits. Some wore what looked like farmer clothing from my homeland or from parts of France and Germany, coats, wide-brimmed hats, and self-made trousers. But others painted a vibrant picture of fashion. If you didn't get too close to the women here, they looked beautiful, though somewhat rough around the waist. They wore various long-sleeve dresses, and most of them tied large belts around their waists, their skirts billowing like ballet dancers' costumes, though, of course, they wore undergarments. The most striking were the Slovaks, wilder than the other ethnic groups. They wore large cowboy hats, baggy white trousers, linen shirts tucked into enormous belts almost as wide as a foot, with brass studs for buttons. Their pant legs were tucked into high boots, and they sported long, black hair and thick, black mustaches. They looked flamboyant but did not leave a positive impression. If they were on stage, the audience would think they were a band of ancient Oriental bandits. However, as I mentioned, they were quite gentle and really just wanted to preserve their national traditions. We arrived in Bistritz at dawn, a quaint, fascinating town. On the border road from Borgo Pass to Bukovina, there were many remnants of a turbulent past that had occurred here. 50 years ago, there were multiple fires, and the town had been devastated 5 times. In the early 17th century, it was besieged for 3 weeks and lost 13,000 people, with hunger and disease contributing to the war's toll. Count Dracula had directed me to the Golden Krone Hotel. I was delighted to find it had an old-world charm, and I could learn everything I wanted about this land. As I expected, when I approached the door, I met a middle-aged woman, cheerfully dressed in the usual peasant outfit. A white dress covered by 2 aprons in front and back, tightly fastened at a moderate level. When I came close, she curtsied and said, "Are you English?" "Yes," I replied. "I'm Jonathan Harker." She smiled and exchanged a few words with a middle-aged man wearing a long white shirt who had followed her to the door. He turned and immediately returned with a letter. "My friend, welcome to the Carpathians. I am eagerly awaiting your arrival. Rest well tonight. At 3 o'clock tomorrow morning, a carriage will depart for Bukovina, a land awaiting you. My carriage will wait for you at Borgo Pass and take you to me. May 4th. I asked the innkeeper to arrange the best seat for me on the carriage, but when I began inquiring about the details, he grew evasive and pretended not to understand German. It was nonsensical. He had understood it perfectly before, or at least he had answered my previous questions accurately. The innkeeper and his wife, the woman who had served me, exchanged glances filled with fear. He muttered that all expenses had been sent along with the letter, and that was all he knew. When I asked about Count Dracula and his castle, the innkeeper and his wife made the sign of the cross and said they knew nothing, refusing to say anything further. It was nearly time for my departure, and I had no time to ask anyone else. These mysteries remained unresolved. Before I left, the woman came to my room and said in an agitated manner, "Must you go? Oh, young man, must you go?" She seemed distraught, and it appeared she had forgotten all her knowledge of German, mixing it with another language I couldn't understand. Her many questions only confused me more. When I told her I had to leave, that I had important business to attend to, she repeated, "Don't you know what day it is today?" I answered that it was May 4th. She shook her head and repeated, "Oh yes, I know, but do you know what day it is?" When I said I didn't understand, she continued, "Tonight is the eve of St. George's Day. Don't you know that at midnight, all kinds of devils will roam the world? And then what will you do?" She was clearly losing her composure, and I tried to reassure her, but it was no use. Finally, she fell to her knees and begged me not to go, at least to wait another day or two. All of this was ridiculous, but I began to feel uneasy. However, business must be attended to, and I would not allow anything to stop it. I tried to help her to her feet, and with all the courage I could muster, I thanked her, saying that my duty came first, and so I had to leave. She stood up, wiped her eyes, and handed me a cross that was hanging from her neck on a string of beads. I didn't know its significance, and like every devout Englishman, I felt compelled to accept such a sacred offering, especially since it seemed impolite to refuse a kind woman in such a state of distress. She seemed to sense the doubt in my expression, and she draped the beads around my neck, saying, "For your mother." Before leaving the room, I write this part of the journal as I sit waiting for the carriage. It's now quite late, and the cross is still around my neck. Perhaps it's the woman's fear, or the abundance of local superstitions about demons, or the cross itself. I'm not sure, but I can't seem to calm myself as usual. If this journal reaches Mina before I do, please deliver my farewell to her. The carriage has arrived. May 5th, the castle. The gloom of the early morning has passed, and the sun has risen above the horizon, appearing above the trees or distant hills. Too far to distinguish now. I'm not sleepy, and of course, no one woke me, so it's my own doing that I'm still writing at this hour. There are many strange events I must record, and if anyone reads them, they will probably be quite surprised by the meal I had before leaving Bistritz. I will describe it as accurately as I can. I ate a dish called thief's meat, which included salted pork, onions, beef, sprinkled with chili, skewered on a stick and roasted over a fire. It was quite similar to cat meat in London. The wine was a type called Mediash Gold, which made you drunk after just a sip, though it wasn't particularly pleasant. I only had a few cups, no more. When I climbed into the carriage, the driver wasn't in his seat. I saw him talking to the innkeeper. From the way they glanced at me, and with some of the passengers sitting near the door listening to the conversation, most of them were looking at me with pity. Clearly, they were talking about me. I could hear some odd words being repeated, and since there were so many different ethnic groups in the crowd, I quietly took out a multilingual dictionary from my bag and looked them up. I must say that they were not welcoming, and some of the words I found were Ordog, Devil, Pokol, Hell, Stragoica, which Vrolok and Vroloslak, both of which, one in Slovak and the other in Serbian, meant werewolf or vampire. I must ask Count Dracula about these superstitions. As we started off, everyone surrounding the inn's door, now a huge crowd, crossed themselves and raised 2 fingers in the sign of the cross toward me. It was a little difficult, but I managed to get one of the passengers to tell me what they meant. At first, he didn't answer, but after learning I was English, he explained that it was some sort of charm or shield to protect against the evil eye. This did nothing to calm me as I began this journey to meet a stranger in a strange land. But everyone was kind, so sad and sympathetic toward me, it was hard not to be moved. I will never forget the last image I saw when I left the inn. A haunting picture of a crowd of people, all making the sign of the cross, standing in a patch of land full of oleander and orange trees, creating a green bouquet in the middle of the open space. Then our driver, dressed in a loose linen outfit, sat in front of the carriage. Here, they call it a gotza, cracking his whip over the 4 small horses lined up in front, and we were off. I quickly forgot my thoughts of demons, distracted by the beauty of the scenery along the road. While I could understand the languages spoken by the passengers, it was not easy to follow them. Before us stretched a land covered in green forests, dotted with hills, occasional trees or farmers' homes, and fence posts at the end of the road. Along the way were blossoming fruit trees, apples, plums, pears, cherries. I also saw fields of green, covered in oak leaves, with petals scattered on the ground. Nestled among the green hills they call the Middle Land are roads that stretch on endlessly, only to suddenly vanish, swallowed up by winding paths overgrown with wild grass, or abruptly ending at a pine forest, with slopes rising like fiery peaks. The journey grows rougher, yet we press on with an urgency, a sense of impatience I can't quite explain. But it was clear that the driver wasn't wasting any time getting to Borgoprund. I had mentioned that the road is magnificent in the summer, but it has never been prepared for the harshness of winter snow. Due to the differing perspectives of generations that have lived in the Carpathians, with their ancient customs, they never made it better. The old hospodar didn't repair it. The Turks believed it was only fixed for invaders, and when war came, the issue truly became dire. Behind the distinctive green hills of Middle Land, the Carpathian range looms, rising and falling with forests that step by step form its majestic peaks. They stretch from both the right and left, and as evening falls, the sun sets between them, casting a radiant light that creates a glorious scene. Deep blues and purples of pear tree shadows, the greens and browns of grasslands and rocky cliffs blending together, followed by an endless perspective of rocky outcrops and mountain walls, where only an infinite distance could make them disappear, and where snow-capped peaks rise boldly. Perhaps the sun was setting somewhere between the mountain cracks, reflecting shimmering lights on the water. A fellow passenger took my hand as we passed the towering hills and the snow-covered peaks to our right as we wound our way along the path. "Look, Isensek, the seed of God." He made the sign of the cross reverently. By the time we reached the end of the road, the sun had set deeply behind us, and the night was beginning to cloak the landscape. In the twilight, the snow-capped peaks stood out against the backdrop of the darkening sky, reflected in a delicate and fragile pink hue. We had probably passed through Czechs and Slovaks with all their beauty, but it was hard to ignore that goiter was a common affliction here. Along the road, many graves marked with crosses stood, and all my fellow passengers crossed themselves as we passed. Scatterings of farmers, both men and women, knelt by the graves, hardly noticing us as we neared. It was as if all their senses, both sight and hearing, were somewhere else, in another world. There was still more that was new to me. For instance, the dry grasses on trees, scattered with wet, glossy bushes, their silver-like trunks glimmering with delicate green leaves. Now, we were passing the special carts used by the farmers, designed like the vertebrae of a snake, engineered to travel over all kinds of terrain. These were surely the groups of farmers on their way home. Czechs in white clothes, Slovaks in bright sheepskin outfits, carrying long metal spears with axes mounted at the end. As evening fell and the air grew colder, the night blended with the twilight light, casting a somber atmosphere over the pines and oaks that grew through the valley between the hills. We were traveling along the road, where the night seemed to begin its battle against the vast white snow. At times, when the path was blocked by pine forests, it felt as if a blanket of night was closing in, the tree trunks becoming low, grayish shapes scattered about, creating an eerie and majestic atmosphere. It evoked the feelings of unease I had experienced earlier in the evening, as the twilight descended and the sun nearly vanished behind the eerie clouds drifting through the Carpathian Valley. Sometimes the hills grew too steep, but the horses only slowed under the driver's urgent guidance. I wanted to get down and walk, as I would have it home, but the driver wouldn't allow it. No, he said. You can't walk here. The wild dogs are very dangerous. And he added with a determined, gentle tone, and the nods of agreement from the other passengers, who glanced around. You'll have enough problems before you sleep tonight. The driver only stopped once to light the lantern on the cart. As the night deepened, the passengers seemed more animated, taking turns chatting with the driver, the conversation growing more intense. For his part, the driver continually cracked the whip, urging the horses on with wild, howling shouts. Through the darkness, I could make out a gray stretch above us, nestled between the hills. My fellow passengers seemed increasingly agitated. The cart rumbled wildly, shaking as if caught in a storm, and swaying like a ship in a tempest. I had to hold on tight. The road was taking us higher still, and it felt as though we were suspended in the air. The cliffs were drawing closer, looking as if they might collapse on me. We had arrived at Borgo Pass. One by one, the passengers handed me small gifts, pressing them into my hands with a sense of urgency that left no room for refusal. They were all strange, various items, but each came with a blessing, good wishes, and the same peculiar symbol of protection I had seen in Bistritz. 2 crossed fingers in the shape of a cross to ward off the evil eye. Then, as we were alone in the vastness, the driver leaned forward, and the passengers leaned out from either side of the cart, staring into the darkness with an anxious air. Something unusual and foreboding was clearly about to happen, but no one would answer my questions clearly. This state of agitation lasted quite a while. Finally, the road we were on turned west. A dark cloud roiled above us, the air thick with tension, and it seemed there was thunder in the distance. This mountain range seemed to split the atmosphere in two, and we were entering the thunderstorm part of it. I was contemplating my own journey to meet the Count. With each passing moment, I waited for a beam of light to break through the night, but all around me remained utterly dark. The only light on the road came from the flickering flame on our cart and the desperate efforts of the horses to reach the clear white clouds. Now we could see the sandy white road ahead, but there was no sign of another waiting carriage, as promised in the letter. The passengers leaned back, seemingly mocking my delay. I was trying to decide what to do when the driver looked around and whispered to the other passengers so quietly I could hardly hear, still about an hour to go. Then, turning to me, he said, in worse German than mine, "No carriage here. You shouldn't wait here, Mr. Englishman. You should go straight to Buchenaiva and come back here tomorrow, or better yet, the day after." As he spoke, the horses neighed and snorted wildly. Then, the farmers suddenly shouted out, crossing themselves, and a 4-horse cart appeared behind us and stopped next to ours. I could see from the lights and the tracks they left behind that these were magnificent black horses guided by a tall, thin man with a long brown beard and a large black hat. He seemed to want to hide his face from us. I could only catch a glimpse of his burning eyes, red as two lanterns, and he turned to us. He spoke to the driver, "You're early tonight, my friend." The driver stammered, "The Englishman is very busy." The stranger continued, "And I suppose that's why you suggested he go on to Bucheneive. My friend, you can't fool me, and my horses are very fast." As he spoke, he smiled, and the light revealed his red lips and teeth as white as ivory. One of my companions whispered to another, quoting a line from the Bible, "Lenore. Den die Tod ten reiten schnell. Let death come swiftly." The strange driver surely heard this. He looked up, his smile so unnerving it sent chills down my spine. The passenger turned away, crossing two fingers and making the sign of the cross. "Let me take your luggage," the strange driver said, and with an overly eager urgency, he took my things and transferred them to his cart. When I got down, the driver gave me a hand. His grip was like steel. This man clearly possessed extraordinary strength. Without saying a word, he jerked the reins and the horses turned their heads. We moved back into the darkness. Looking back, I saw, through the light, the panic-stricken horses of the coach and the last image of my companions crossing themselves. Then the driver cracked his whip and called out to the horses, and we continued on our journey to Bucheneive. When they had completely disappeared into the night, I suddenly felt a shiver and a sense of loneliness overcame me. But then a black cloak was thrown over my shoulders, a blanket draped over my knees, and the driver spoke to me in perfect German. "The night is truly terrifying, sir, and my lord the Count has ordered me to look after you. There is a bottle of Slivovitz, a strong plum brandy from this country, under your seat, and you should try it." I said nothing but began to calm myself. It felt strange, but not a fearful sensation. I thought everything had changed, and I could accept it despite the strange night ride that was carrying me away. The coach raced ahead, and we had completely turned around and entered a straight path. It seemed we were going in circles, but that was the main thing I could gather. I wanted to ask the driver what this meant, but I was afraid to, as I sensed something unsafe about the land I was in, and it seemed best not to stay another minute longer. Curious about the time, I struck a match and glanced at my watch. It was just past midnight. This made me shiver as I recalled the superstitions and eerie tales about this time of night that had been creeping into my mind in recent days. I tried to suppress this pathological feeling. Then, from a distant farmhouse, a dog began howling, a painful and terrified cry as though it feared something. This was followed by another dog, then another, increasing with the wind blowing through the road. It seemed as though the wild howls were spreading across the land, reaching everywhere the imagination could stretch in this gloomy night. From the moment the first howl was heard, the horses began to grow tense and restless. The driver spoke to them gently. They slowly calmed down, but they trembled and sweated as though trying to flee from sudden fear. And from the distant hills, the howls seemed to grow louder and clearer. The howls of wolves which affected both the horses and me. As I was about to jump out of the coach and run, the horses again became agitated and began to go wild, despite the driver's tremendous effort to keep them from bolting. However, after a few minutes, as my ears adjusted to the sounds, the horses suddenly stopped, silent. The driver jumped down and stood in front of them. He spoke to them tenderly, whispering in their ears like a trainer speaking to his horses, and with extraordinary effort under the driver's soothing touch, the horses were once again brought under control, though they still trembled. The driver returned to his position, jerked the reins, and the coach began to move again. After traveling some distance along the road, he suddenly changed direction and turned onto a narrow path that veered sharply to the right. We quickly entered thick brush, and as we veered right, we continued through a narrow passage. Jagged rock walls surrounded us tightly. Though we were protected in this way, we could still hear the howling wind, the murmurs and whispers of the rocks, the rustling of branches as we sped by. The air grew colder, snow began falling heavily, and soon we were almost covered by a blanket of white. The cold wind still carried the howls of the dogs, which grew more oppressive along the road we traveled. The sound of wolves barking grew nearer, as if they were coming at us from all directions. I was paralyzed with fear, and the horses were just as frightened. The driver, however, remained unperturbed. He kept glancing around, but all I could see was the thick darkness. Suddenly, to my left, a flickering blue flame appeared. The driver stopped for a moment. He checked the horses, then jumped down and disappeared into the night. I didn't know what to do as the howls of the wolves grew louder and closer. As I hesitated, the driver suddenly reappeared, saying nothing, and returned to his place, and we continued our journey. I felt as though I was dreaming, trapped in an endless nightmare, and what had happened to me was a terrifying vision. When the flame appeared near the road, close enough that, despite the surrounding darkness, I could still see every movement of the driver, he quickly approached the blue flame. It was faint, too weak to reflect the surrounding land. The driver picked up some stones and formed some kind of device. It seemed there was some optical illusion at play. When the man stood between me and the flame, he didn't block it, so I could still see the eerie light clearly. This startled me, but the phenomenon only lasted a moment, so I thought my eyes had been deceived through the darkness. Once the blue flame vanished, we seemed to be in a darker, gloomier place, with the howls of the wolves surrounding us, seemingly following us in a circle. Finally, the driver disappeared over a hill. During the time he was gone, the horses began to tremble and panic, whinnying in fear. I couldn't pinpoint the cause, because at that moment, the howls of the wolves suddenly stopped. But when the moon emerged from the cloud, casting a pink light on the jagged rocks, I could see around us a circle of wolves with their white teeth and long, lolling tongues, their muscular legs and shaggy coats. Their eerie silence was far more terrifying than their howls. I was nearly paralyzed with fear. This is what happens when someone faces something so terrifying that they can grasp the full significance of it. Immediately, the wolves began howling as if the moon had a special effect on them. The horses leaped and reared, desperately looking around with wild eyes for a way to escape. But the horrific wolf circle had closed in, trapping their prey inside. I called for the driver to return, as now our only chance of survival was to break through the wolf's circle with his help. I shouted loudly and fiercely from the coach, hoping my voice would scare the wolves in one direction and help the driver set a trap to deceive them. I don't know how the driver arrived, but I heard him issue authoritative commands, and following the sound, I saw him standing on the road. He waved his long arms as though clearing away some invisible barrier. The wolves began to retreat. Just then, another cloud covered the moon, and we stood again in the dark. When I could see the man once more climbing back into the coach, the wolves had vanished. This strange and extraordinary event horrified me, and I couldn't speak or move, paralyzed by fear. Time passed again as we continued down the road, but now the darkness returned, with another cloud swirling around the moon. We were ascending, sometimes going down short stretches, but generally going upward. Suddenly, I was jolted awake when the driver stopped the horses in front of a large, desolate castle, with high black windows that let no light through, and crumbling walls without battlements, cutting an uneven line across the sky.